And now it's time for the Philosophy Power Hour.
All right, everybody, welcome to the third edition of the Philosophy Power Hour. Introducing our members. Firstly, he's not late for the show. If you approach the speed of light, we have the Philosophy Undergrad, the Critique of Pure Dio.
Really?
Secondly, he says he'd never heard an animal, and yet we have to listen to him from the YouTube channel Perspective Philosophy, the Phenomenology of Lewis. Thirdly, working on his PhD in philosophy, a man who protects his inalienable right to always be wrong, Allegory of the Dave. And finally, sitting in his bathrobe in the middle of this living room, your host, Shadow Starshine. How is everyone doing?
Good, man.
Great.
Good. Loving the intro.
I'm loving the energy here.
Woo!
Yeah.
All right. So the premise is simple. Each of us have come with a prepared question to ask the group. It can be any kind of question that provokes philosophical conversation and interest, so long as it's not too complicated to ask or takes too long to explain. Then we're going to rant on that topic until we either all agree, we're too angry, or we're too bored to continue. At that point, we'll move on to the next person's question down the list. During the segment, you can ping questions at me, and whoever sticks around can try and answer them afterwards. All right, so last episode, we ended with Dave the Dastard's question about what scares us most about the future, which means we shall be moving on to Dio's question. All right, Dio, you want to hit us up?
Yeah, okay. So, my prepared question is, has the introduction of fallacies into layman consciousness been beneficial or harmful to general discourse? Essentially, I'm trying to put forth the question of whether the knowledge of what makes an argument fallacious, or just the general knowledge of that, has that actually improved conversations on things like Discord or in daily life, or has that actually ruined them?
So you're more wondering if the fallacy is more of an issue than the actual understanding of fallacies.
Yeah, suppose that. Yeah.
Ruin them. I'm saying it right now.
I have a kind of mixed perspective on this, because when I was getting into critical thinking, fallacies were part of my tool belt that I used to learn how to figure out whether or not an argument was good or not. So I feel like coming from that kind of angle, it's really helped me be able to analyze things.
Yeah, I can't help but acknowledge that the laws of logic and understanding fallacies is useful when we go into for example, you understand that the naturalistic fallacy exists. You understand that certain arguments aren't really arguments and that they're appeals to authority or something along those lines. That being said, people like laymen these days tend to refer to fallacies as if it's a good argument if it's not committing a fallacy, as if a valid argument is a sound argument. And that's something that I think is it's pointless to say. It's just disgusting. It makes us feel sick. Mainly because valid arguments, although are useful, they're reliant upon the truth of that premise. And you can't discover the truth of that premise necessarily without understanding the argument itself. And understand the argument itself, you've actually got to have discourse. You've got to allow people to explain that point, perhaps the reiterate that point in a different way that allows them to overcome, let's say, the four terms fallacy, where they've put it in a way that was incorrect, they realize that, and then they overcome it in discourse. But because that locked down into fallacies and arguing about whether it is a fallacy or not a fallacy, they're not actually making any headway. And this is why I would say that this is the Socratic method has been under attack in this way. We're not actually able to go into discourse now because too many people are locked into thinking about what is a fallacy, what is not a fallacy, and always tying it back to almost this authority itself. They're appealing to logic as the authority of what is true or not, and that's not necessarily what logic does.
I think I agree. It reminds me of like he who goes hunting for the wood misses sight of the trees. It's the problem is that when people go looking for fallacies, it turns a discussion more into like fact checking. It seems more like a competition. It doesn't actually develop within people the ability to have rhetoric or the ability to express themselves or to actually tackle the ideas that are being had. Instead, we're just looking for pluses and minuses as if it's like a mathematical equation. It takes the nuance out of the argument.
Yeah.
Could I know you were talking about valid isn't sound. I was wondering if somebody wants to go into what those terms mean for anybody listening.
Sure. So validity is just what necessarily follows from certain premises. So that's what it means in logic. So if you have a few, assumptions or views of the world, like let's take Socrates as a man, and that all men are mortal. Well, usually those are the first one. The first one goes first, but the second one goes first. But whatever. You have those two views. Now, validity is about what follows from those views. Soundness is about the truth, both what follows and the truth value of the views itself. So, like an opposite view would be all men are immortal. Socrates is a man. What would follow from that? And then we would have to think whether that was true as well. So if it's sound, then it's both valid, the conclusion, and true. So the necessary conclusion of all men are mortal and all men are immortal and Socrates is a man is that Socrates is immortal. So we wouldn't think that Socrates is immortal, obviously, first of all, because he's dead. And we don't think that all men are immortal. So that premise is seems false. Yeah, he lives in all of it. But so we would say, right, that it's not sound, but it seems valid.
Okay, good.
Blame the trade.
So okay, so I kind of agree with you. I do think fallacies. The problem is that if you think that focusing on fallacies is the entirety of what an argument is, then you're going to be stunted. You're never really going to find the truth of things. But I do think it is a useful tool in your tool belt when doing rhetoric with people.
Yeah, I think it depends on what sort of discussion you're looking for. So me, I'm very into romanticism as a means of doing philosophy, of it being artistic, of it being expression, emotive, and sometimes uncomfortable, to bring about those sensations within the listener or the reader, for them to be able to reflect and contemplate on them. And you see, if you're looking for fallacies, you're not going to be able to have that sensation. It's as if judging an artwork on the brush strokes. It's like, well, sometimes it's valid. It's valid. It's a good thing to try to listen to music and break it down into score and tempo and tone and an octave, but don't lose sight of the whole symphony. You want to have that sensation, and I feel there's a danger. There's a danger that an overfocus on fallacies would deter people from having that in my mind a more primary philosophical experience.
I think that the awareness of fallacies. I understand like the general like idea that, okay, well, if you're kind of only aware of fallacies, then you're gonna, like you said, miss the forest for the trees, or the trees for the forest, or whatever. So, but I think rather what we've seen is probably just a severe misunderstanding of what fallacies are and what they're trying to like get at. That I usually find in like discourse. So like I'll have like somebody tell me, the most commonly, I think, spoken fallacy is argument, right? This actually our form of argument, which is not necessarily always fallacious, but is viewed as such, and is also viewed as like just insulting a person, which is not really should be a part of maybe general civil conversation, but isn't fallacious, right? So like I think there's like and then there's like I think the introduction of these terms that were mostly focused on informal like I just forms of argument have now been put into layman conversation in a way that I think has now changed their meaning. So now in Wikipedia, like if you went up and search what argumentum ad hominem is, you actually get a like a false view of what it is. It's supposed to be insulting person and not focusing on the argument, but no, it's actually a form of argument. So like there's two views, right? And then one view has become so common that now it's deemed as like a legitimate view of what that term is. I think that's problematic if you're going to use it in the view of what a fallacy really is, and a fallacy really is a problem in the form of an argument, not simply not an intentional argument or an insult or something else.
Yeah,
So
I think I agree with that in many ways. I think for example, what we'll have to realize is that this will only, I think, worsen semantics. People are going to fall back onto what is a fallacy. They're going to start looking into fallacy, and the argument becomes about what a fallacy is, what a fallacy isn't, and we're going to be and the meaning of like when to apply and when not to apply these fallacies. For example, there's ad hominem. I remember I was having a debate with someone, and I said, "Well, that's ad hominem," and he said, "No, it's just an insult." Well, it's like, well, I couldn't tell if it was even like, well poisoning. Was he trying to affect my argument in the future? Like, well, you're being ridiculous. Therefore, any argument you make within this discourse will be ridiculous. Or like
could
absurd.
you be talking about?
I don't know. I don't know.
Well.
Or would it be, would it be ad hominem? Is he attacking the argument I'm stating, or is it just an insult within the discourse? So it's one of those things where we could have sat and argued that I would have made the point that it was ad hominem and well poisoning, and he would have been no. But it all we've done is escape the argument. I could have just brushed off even if it is ad hominem and just no, that's not what my argument's getting at.
I feel like there's two discussions on the table here, which is one is the idea of thinking about fallacies during a conversation a useful way to learn about the conversation, and Dave is showing these expressive ways where maybe you're just missing the point. But then there's also the discussion of whether bringing them up, even if they were valid, is worth your time, and I think that's a little bit harder. I do think it's useful to keep in the back of your own mind if you're employing something like the Socratic method in a conversation. You're trying to understand why their point or the things they're saying doesn't make sense to you, and your knowledge of these fallacies might guide the kind of questions you want to ask and where you want to lead them. But perhaps it's not useful to just state the name of the fallacy and say, here's why you're wrong. Maybe you're just wasting your time on that.
I completely agree. I mean, I cannot recollect any philosophical paper I've read, which had been written in disagreement to another individual, and in it claims that a fallacy has been made. Like, I've never read a paper saying, oh, well, I think Peter Singer has made I don't know, a correlation rather than causation fallacy or whatever. I've never really heard people actually use these terms in academic journals. But maybe I've just...
I don't think they do either. Everything I've read, I've never seen or even watched, any kind of philosophical discourse. I've never seen actual philosophers use these fallacies just in their like raw form. They tend to reiterate them in some sort of criticism or to aid the discourse. So you'd be like, if someone did make, let's say, ad hominem or something, you'd go, well, no, it's not about me. Look at my argument. Or,
I think
I
completely agree. because I think I think we're actually in agreement. I think what we're saying is that when you tell someone that they've made a fallacy, it cannot help but come across personal. It's as if it's saying, you're being stupid somehow, or you're being idiotic. When someone's going to write a criticism, they tend to talk around the fact that a fallacy has been made, or they would say it in a way which is more constructive for the development of the discussion, rather than just, oh, by the way, this clearly can't stand because you straw man the position, and by the side, I'm going to insult you as well.
Yeah.
It's just not proper.
Yeah, I don't think that it's good. It's good behavior more than anything, and I think it's not constructive. It's not good philosophy, and I think the point is that even just shouting fallacies, well, you're not really aiding the conversation. Even if they have made a fallacy, right? Well, that doesn't help your argument. It doesn't show why you're right. It might just show why they're wrong. And you both start yelling fallacies at each other, then you're not actually going to get anywhere. So what you need to do is like, okay, yeah, point out that mistake in a way that is not only critical but aids the discussion, helps them get somewhere, like helps the conversation move.
I'm not sure I completely agree with that point, because I do think there is value in simply taking someone from their hard position to sort of an agnostic position about it. And in that, the only thing you need to do is show that they've made an error in their reasoning. You don't necessarily have to have an opinion that replaces it.
Oh yeah, true, but
There's a. Do you want to? You can go now.
yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I'm not necessarily saying that you have to have a strong, position in order to counteract someone. Like, you could literally just be taking a skeptic's view. But the point is how you even transmit that fallacy makes a difference within the conversation.
I think we mostly agree. I'm very curious who here thinks that they've been guilty of it in the past, of overusing fallacies.
I think I have. I think it helps though when you're getting into like conversation, like you said, Shadow, to have a name for problems and argument, like common problems and argument, both to test like your own arguments, right, and to look at other people's arguments. But like yeah, I mean, I also get what's been raised here, but this isn't particularly a fallacy, but I think that I've had conversations that are incredibly long with Shadow about like something like the nature of the burden of proof. Right?
Yeah, that was a long one.
Yeah, it was a long one, right? So I mean, just to like tell everybody here, the burden of proof is essentially the idea of who should have the burden to prove a point in a conversation, who should raise evidence in a conversation first, for it to be accepted as legitimate. And first of all, I mean, I don't see like burden of proof being commonly raised in like ancient philosophy. Like, I don't know if there's like any ancient philosophers that talk about burden of proof I'm not familiar with, like as like formalized as a concept. That might just be a mistaken, like they just don't realize that's a thing that was happening. But like I think when we come to something that isn't particular fallacious but is a common, I guess, idea in how we converse with each other, yeah, I mean, I think we might have to have more intense discussions about fallacies, maybe, and then maybe root those back into the conversation, right? So that it can still, flow. It just takes longer, I suppose. I don't know.
I think as well, like with the burden of proof, as you've said, like if you look at it, like sometimes conversations can be really hindered by trying to put like the burden of proof on people, whether maybe point out something that isn't related to the subject matter necessarily, like so heavily. So if you're talking normative ethics, and then someone goes, but there's a meta ethic that needs explained behind this, but you're trying to discuss normative ethics, and that's what the conversation was supposed to be about in the first place, then it's useful. Don't get me wrong. We need to have that conversation, but you can't have both conversations at the same time.
I think I kind of understand Dio's point, though, is to say that if you're having a conversation and perhaps, you start, because of that conversation, you start discussing what a fallacy is, that in a way is you two discussing what tools should we be using to analyze this discussion, and maybe that is an important step that you do need to do.
Oh, that's a really good point. I definitely think that is true. It brings back the attention to the presuppositions and to the methods at play. But there's also another point, because I think that depending on what the discussion is about, what game we're talking, the language is going to be different. And I think in some language games, so in some sorts of discussions we would have on philosophy, certain fallacies would be more applicable than others. So the naturalistic fallacy may not actually be fallacious if you're a moral realist naturalist, and you would say, well, that just is morality. Morality is nature, i.e., survival of the fittest. And then they would say that it's not that it ought to be that way. It just that is the ought at play. And if it was something other, then that would be something other. And then they try to avoid issues and objections about is or gaps. But I suppose the point I want to make is that depending on what it is we're talking about and from what position we take, some fallacies are not even applicable anymore. And I think what's interesting is that we really do need to have discussions about the methods we're using, because we can see examples where certain criticisms of methods are no longer applicable. So the method has changed, and we just haven't even realized it. And I think what you brought out there, Shadow, was something which yes, we should spend a lot more time thinking about.
True, but then it's one of those things where I think we can get locked into then semantics and never actually end in the discussion, because if we spend however long trying to define the rules of any given language game, then we're going to be locked in that for a while. We're gonna be talking about how are we going to accommodate each other's discourse, when in reality I think if you look at like a position like Habermas's position, perhaps we need to care less about how we're using these tools and be sincere enough, like as this server works, use the principle of charity in cases. Take the strongest possible argument they can give and that they could have given and approach that. Give some sincerity to the argument itself, so that if there is some problem in communication, then in the way in which we're both analyzing like whatever topic it is, we can overcome them within the discourse itself. We'll learn the rules as we go along.
But I think you're just talking along a different axis. I don't think charity and then straightening out your language games is the same thing. Charity might allow you to do that, but if you don't put importance in doing that, you could be just using the same word to have two different concepts and not realizing it, and wondering why you're butting heads the entire time.
Oh yeah, we do need to talk about it to some degree, but I'm saying that like there's also going to be a hard limit on that discussion. We're not going to the chances are like two people who understand fallacies, for example, like take for example with Dave, and the ought is gap. I'm probably going to have a lot of nasty conversations with people about the ought is gap very soon, and the ought of X and so on, and I can't help but think that if I try and although it's important for me to outline these differences with them, there's going to be an issue where some people will just go, no, absolutely not. You cannot get an ought from an is, and in which case, yeah, we mightn't be able to converse, but perhaps if I was able to, go through the Socratic method, if they were able to understand how I'm actually, applying this and able to show it more in practice than in, just plain definition, if I just take them through the point, then they might understand it better. And I think this is almost like a point in two ways of being. You can understand something by using it, or you can understand something by analyzing it. And I think sometimes by analyzing words, we can destroy the concepts in which they're connected to. The conceptual web begins to break, and then we're left with an empty context, an empty concept, that's been relinquished of all context. So it depends on how far we'll go with this. It's like Augustine when he talks about time. There's a hard point where if someone goes, well, what is time? And he can't define it. He would then have to define it within relation to experience, to the game. He has to just go back into the game it's like and that's how he would show it. He would say, like, for example, a logical fallacy is this, and then give an example of its use. And I think that's just an inevitability of all language.
Well, I mean, I would probably take, the opposite approach when it comes to Habermas, and I would say that the conversation kind of never, I don't think ever will stop, right? I do think that it's important, right, to be able to have conversations that go beyond just the some certain initial assumptions, right, to flesh out further, like further dialogues and conversations. Like, for example, if you're talking to an anarchist, right? I mean, there's one level where you're just like, oh well, I don't think anarchism is viable, right? Like, I don't think society could exist without the state. And then you can, go further to like ask, well, how would such and such exist? How would such and such other things exist, right? So, like, I think that, yeah, there is a need to go past like that initial assumption there, but that doesn't necessarily mean the conversation never ever stops, like at that initial point, or at any point in the question. You can go further, and you can choose where you want to go in the conversation, and I think that should be talked about. Like, how far do we want to go with accepting some premises as just being true, right? To then discuss the conclusion, and then go further and further, right,
Never
into
accept
to their
anything.
ideas.
I'm with you there. I think there has to be a point for any conversation to be useful. You're going to need to accept certain premise. You're going to have to say, like, okay, well, this isn't the topic of any given conversation that we're going to have. We might accept that there is a reality, for example, and we're not going to argue that the mind reality distinction exists, because that's not what we're talking about. But then it's to outline almost that you cannot bring this up as a criticism of my argument just because you're losing, for example. Well, we've had a half-hour discussion, you're losing the argument. Yeah, but you're not actually real. Isn't a strong position to hold.
Yeah.
That would just mean
actually-
you've defeated yourself.
I would say actually that probably is a fallacy. It probably is a fallacy to say I'm going to accept these terms for the sake of having the discussion, but then as soon as the discussion goes away I don't like, I'm going to withdraw, assuming those positions. It was bad faith. You entered the discussion in bad faith, and it's at that point I'd say you're not being a good character. You're being unvirtuous. So I shan't speak no more.
I shan't.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that would be fallacious. There would be nothing like there would be no logical problem with it, right?
No, it'd be informal. I mean, it wouldn't be a formal.
Even
well, it's
informal,
more just a
like,
dick thing to do, I guess.
Even an informal fallacy, I don't think it would satisfy that, right? I mean, informal fallacies do point to like context and stuff like that, but I mean, they're also like they're also important for logic, right? So I wouldn't say, right, that that I guess in this case, going in that direction would be fallacious, but I would say that like that would be rhetorically, that would be rhetorically problematic.
I think it would be dependent on how it was done. I could imagine it being the case that we would say, okay, for the sake of argument, I'm going to assume this, that, and the other, and we'll have our discussion. But then you convince me that the result is something which I don't like. And so to avoid that being true, I'm going to withdraw the certain presumptions and assumptions I've made. And I say, well, that can't be true because it would never have got to that point anyway.
I actually think that
they were fighting on your
we've had
premise.
that. We've had that experience when during your debate with Ask Yourself, Lewis, when objective was being disputed, he would actually take away the premise that there are other people often just to not go down a certain line.
Yeah, I think that's the point. Like, if you, especially in meta ethics, there's sometimes where if you're discussing what objective is, and then you get them to agree on one definition of objective, and then they just withdraw it and go, no, this is the only definition, but yet they'll still point to something being objective within reality itself as separate to them, but other people aren't separate to them, and there's
It's
points
just
in which you end
multiple
up in
levels.
semantics. Yeah, like we end up in semantics, and this is the worry, right? And I think the good thing about, and I think the argument is, I think we're going to end up in almost like an Aristotelian concept of trying to balance, virtues and vices here, because there's a point in which we should accept, assumptions. We accept that reality exists, for example, in a normative ethics debate, or a phenomenological debate in some respects, depending on what we're speaking about. But then in a metaethical one or a metaphysical one, well, we're not. Like we need to outline that. So it's understanding the rules of your game. Now, yeah, before any given conversation, say the rules. Say where you are, say what you're going to be talking about. And then from that point, you'll know when to apply logical fallacies, or at least you should do with.
I mean, it might be important that
Technical
some premises that you might assume necessary to continue the conversation on a particular subject might actually not be, right? So, like, I might object to the idea that, hey, well, you need some external reality for ethics or something like that, right? Like, I don't know. Like, let's just take that as a possibility. You could have that as a conversation, right? If somebody doesn't accept a certain premise, but those premises need to be outlined like I just like when the conversation starts. And then, I mean, if they're not, because sometimes people are going to think of things that they might have had assumptions that they didn't realize, right? Then you might have to have that conversation again about that to reorient the conversation and to figure out what presumptions you're working with. And that's like a constant like shift that has to be going on in a conversation. And people are going to make mistakes. They're not going to you don't have total knowledge of what your interlocutor's assumptions are, or even your assumptions when you're having a discussion. So you're probably gonna have to shift the conversation if it goes on long enough.
Yeah,
you're
gonna have to just like take it as you go. And I think this is why I made the point where it's like, we need to be able to have the Socratic method first. We need to be able to speak and have and converse. And this is why I said Habermas was good, because he's really just trying to get people to talk more than anything. It's a theory of communication. Communication is the most important aspect of this dynamic. If we can start to try and communicate ideas with each other, talk normatively around objects, then we'll start to pick up the rules of the game. We'll start to understand what's going on. But if we're locked, if we're just deadlocked into no, I reject this, you reject that, and we're not making any headway, then I think minds will never change. And I think there's we're going to limit discourse. So when we're going back to the question, do I think logical fallacies have done anything good for individuals within like laymen in philosophical discourse? I think they've done good getting people interested in philosophy. I think they've done good getting people to understand what may or may not be a fallacy, but their application has been wanting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it is a very good toolkit that people start with, because a lot of them are very simple. Like an argument from authority or something is very simple to comprehend, and you start to feel the legitimacy of how logic works, and then you're very interested in using these tools and trying to apply them to things that people are saying. But then you kind of notice a shift of them kind of falling into the background of your mind. They don't become the forefront of conversation anymore, but they just become something you keep in mind and a way to help you structure the things you're saying. And
it's like,
in that way, I think it's positive. But I suppose if you're the sort of person who's kind of gone beyond that, beyond just pointing out fallacies, you get a bit annoyed, looking at something that was probably your previous state, the way you used to look at things. It's kind of like us looking at the rationale of a child. In a sense, I don't mean that to be entirely insulting.
That was a wonderful child. I don't know what you're talking about.
That was brilliant. Everything I said was just right.
Logically consistent always.
I think there's another danger though with the whole focus on the fallacies, is that sometimes a fallacy could come about more as an error of speech rather than an error of the reasoning, if you know what I mean. So it's a person who's misspoken or mistyped, or their rhetoric skills weren't that great.
Yeah. People
And
get
so we
held
say,
to
oh,
those.
we say it's fallacious, therefore your argument's wrong. It's
Yeah,
like,
I
well,
do
no,
hate
he
that.
just,
I
he
absolutely
just didn't express it.
do hate when people do that. In like, oh, you've misspoken, and here's the fallacy of your misspeak, and then someone wants to say, well, that's not really what I meant. Well, it's what you typed, so I'm going to hold it to you in your face. I think in any charitable discussion, if someone wants to change the way they said something, you just absolutely have to allow it.
Yeah, I think that's a given. But I think that to say that as well, that people can just pick and choose what they say is another issue. So that, oh, no, but I didn't mean that. So if we go back to take, for example, the ask yourself position, he would shift his position, what could be said bad faith. So there is
But that's not the
a
same,
leniency.
because he
Oh, no,
shifted.
I agree.
He was
I agree.
playing on two levels rather than taking something he said back.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. But it's one of those issues where I think we do have to outline somewhat the rules of the game, and then from that point, act charitably.
All right, so
All right.
you guys want to move on?
Yeah,
That's one of the more extensive answers we've done, isn't it? Actually.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
Sweet.
rhetoric's very interesting, but yeah, let's move off from that topic, and we got 23 minutes for yours, Lewis. What do you got for us?
Okay, so here's an easy one. What is the self?
Oh,
Wow. Okay. All right, Lewis.
Great, Lewis. Great.
So many people will associate the self in a Wittgensteinian way, where the self is an accumulation of concepts in which one identifies with. The I, particularly, being the experience of oneself that you've internalized. The idea of yourself. That is the self-awareness. To understand what you are would be to understand your experience of you. However, could it not be just said that you are your awareness, and that when we falsely ally ourselves to various concepts, and we're unable to shift this conception of I, do we not lock ourselves into what could be fallible? This might not be us. It might, for example, something might not be in our interests. We might associate ourselves with a hatred of a certain type of music, or a love for a certain food, when in relation to our actual being, to our experience, this might be untrue. So can we say that when we lock ourselves into what is a concept and not allow it to shift, is that actually us? Or are we just our awareness of concepts, and by allowing them to shift, we can then rediscover ourselves through experience on a daily basis?
So, yeah, I am of the opinion that being aware of your concept is a piece of you. That is one of the things that constitutes you. But your awareness of a concept can also just report something false. And I think that's something we have to accept, even if that is an aspect of you. It's falsely reporting yet another aspect of you, which is a different type of experience.
But if I was to ask what you are, you would give me the concepts in which you ally your identity with. But what you are mightn't be any of those concepts. What you are might be something entirely different. And I can't help but think of this in the way that Blanchot does. And I think I've mentioned Blanchot like a million times now. But the idea that when we look upon something and we conceptualize it, we destroy it, we're obliterating it, and we replace it with a notion and a conceptual representation of the object itself. And unless we're willing to replace these concepts against our experience, or allow them to grow and create new conceptual webs, I cannot help but think that the fallibility of ourselves, what we think of ourselves, is actually false. We might not even know ourselves. And when we say that this is me, what we're actually saying is, I think this is me.
Well, I'm uncertain. I would typically take a kind of like Wittgensteinian language game position, or I would take a Hindu position, shockingly. So I would say that what you mean by the self changes depending on what context we're having it in. If you're asking me scientifically, then the self I would report to be the brain. But if you're asking me perhaps phenomenologically, I'd give you perhaps a more romanticized, artistic sort of response. And I'd say that both contain relative truths to the discussions that have been held at play. So on one hand, I would say that. But on the other hand, I'd take an Upanishadic reading where they ask, are you he who asks or he who answers? It matters not, for you are the question. It's kind of this interesting monistic point where I would say I am just as much me awake as I am in my dream. It's still me. My awareness of myself, so to speak, I would say is secondary. For to be aware of myself requires it to be a me there anyway, independent of that awareness of self. So I would say that I'm. I would say that I'm the point of experience. So it's as if to say there's lots of content of experiences that I have, but I'm always finding myself to be in the middle of it. It's like I am in the middle of my own world. I'm the one hearing it. I'm the one seeing it. It's happening around me. That's me. I'm a location. I am the center of the experience. I'm not a thing. I'm a place. And relative to that discussion, the place which I find myself in would change. That's the understanding I held.
I want to also point out that this is two different interesting questions, because we can talk about it purely in phenomenological terms, just what we think the self is in terms of experience. And then we can also have the discussion presuming materialism and what sort of materialistic aspects would need to exist to account for these phenomenological explanations. And I think those are both very interesting conversations.
That I agree. I mean, like, well, obviously, I'm aiming towards phenomenology. I can't help it. But the reason for that is because I made an argument against a guy called Leahy. I think that's how you say it. Leahy wrote a book called Against Liberation, and in that book, he said that an animal would be incapable of a subjective experience because they would not have an internalized concept of I. But I think he made a mistake, because I would say that, let's take the point on, you being the question, like that Dave gave before. You're the experience itself, regardless of whether you have the concept of pain, whether you have the concept of yourself in regards to pain. You might be experiencing that. You just mightn't be able to make it intelligible to the point in which you can reiterate it to another individual. You may be able to communicate the experience, but you would still be experiencing it.
I want to jump in on this one. I'll let Dio go because he hasn't said anything, but after that I want to get into it.
If you're going to talk about centering around your experience, I think that's really just a matter of the natural attitude. I think that's certainly what Husserl would say. I mean, the natural attitude is the view that your experiences are separated from the I, right? I mean, but I think at closer investigation, right? I mean, into yourself, you realize that there isn't really much of a separation. I think, especially in conversations centered around this concept called ego death, right? That people experience when they take some certain substances. But you could also do this through meditation, where the concept of self disappears. But I think that's a rather incorrect way to formulate it. Rather, the experience, the natural attitude, the view of the natural attitude disappears, and there is no separation between the experience, the experience and the self, right? Because the self is the experience, and so on. So you don't get that separation, and I don't think that's quite the same as what an animal would sort of describe, because it is possible for people to talk about after they've gone through, ego death, what was happening, right? They're not able to articulate it completely well, some better than others, because it's not like their other experiences. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they lack communication. Like people can even communicate during ego death, right? So all these things indicate to me that lacking the natural attitude, right, the centering of the self, isn't the same thing as having a sense of self.
Sure,
So
I would agree. I I would agree, but I would say only this having a sense of self is probably more of a product is a product of language and a matter of cognition. It's so like in a Wittgensteinian sense, where the idea of spirit is best understood to be when we talk of something as if it has a body and yet we know it doesn't. So like dance or justice, we'd say, the arm of justice came down favorably. It's like, well, we don't literally mean it, but we're talking as if we're conceptualizing it as a being. I just think humans conceptualize things in that way, and so we conceptualize ourselves in that way. I just notice how dualistic our language is. I have to say it's my brain. I could just be the brain, but still the brain refers to itself as if it's something different. I think of most of this.
I wanted to, I want to jump in on this one because I think there is a distinct difference about what we call the self and then when we talk about ourselves to ourselves. In so much that I think these are pieces of the same thing, but one is being put into a different sort of language game so that we can discuss it with ourselves in a different way. And if you're talking about an ego death or this self going away, I can only understand that in terms of the language of the self going away. But if you're still having an experience, you're still having that pivot point, that understanding that you are the one getting this information, you are the one experiencing it, and everything that's happening right now is revolving around this concept. I do think that this concept is what gives rise to the sense of experience. I think this is why we don't think of things like computers as being aware of themselves. We might say that I sent data to your computer, but the computer doesn't have a unified understanding of its pieces. It's taking in that data to a specific memory address and then putting it into a specific piece of its hard drive, but it doesn't really have a concept that hard drive and that memory bus and the RAM and all these things are the one thing that it is. And I do think that if it was able to gain a concept such as that, that is when we would start calling it an experiencer, much like we are.
I can't help but disagree with that. I think that
I was like, are you gonna go and say anything after that?
Afterwards, yeah.
I can't help but think that that there is probably, I think Dave's going to start talking about substance in a minute and essence and all that, but I think that probably more so there is an issue here, not just with saying that a computer would. I think if a computer had a concept of self, that does not give it the faculty that is necessary for self-awareness. I think that is separate and an emergent property of what we are. It's the difference between what is a human mind and a computer with its component pieces. The component pieces cannot produce a mind by what they are.
I only agree with that because they don't have the same sort of pattern seeking that our brains do. We attempt to unify data. Our brains unify data, whereas a computer doesn't. It just has the data.
Our self would then not be the concept of self, but our ability to conceptualize or understanding itself. That's a fact. That's the faculty. That's not the actual concept. Here's a nice quote from Blanchot that I think might forward the discussion. Can he act in such a way that death will be for him the force of the negative, the cutting edge of decision, the moment of supreme possibility where his own impossibility will come to him in the form of power? Or on the contrary, is the experience of one radical reversal where he dies but cannot die, where death delivers him to the impossibility of dying?
Yeah, well, that cleared it right up for me.
Oh, isn't that sexy language?
I know, it's nice, isn't it? What I like about that is, is it the point in which you are the will itself? But even if you are the will itself, does that not just make you useless? Because I think what I would take the position is that this is you. This is your awareness. This is your understanding. It's you, but you're empty. And in your emptiness, you're incapable of any intelligibility. All you can do is experience. You can't, in a Nietzschean way, discharge your strength in the world, because you have magnitude, but you have no direction. This is the will in its form in which you act in the world. The self is a vector. It has force and direction. What I would say is that it's just the magnitude in that regard. You've lost any direction. And to be useful towards whatever goal you want to go through, to even want itself, to have a content of your desire, you require concepts. You require the destruction of reality and the intelligibility of the idea.
This idea of being in some way related to a direction is quite Sartrean in some respects. So Sartre would say that man is not is, man is becoming. It's that man is forever changing, and there's nothing necessary for a person to be, for their being precedes their essence, and that is what it is to be condemned to be free. Is that you're born into the world, you find yourself existing, Dasein, for no apparent reason, with no explanation, and then you realize that there's no objective purpose or meaning to anything, and then you've got to make yourself, and that is as if it's a never-ending requirement that you're forever building yourself, so you're better understood to be a description of the process, to be the builder rather than the builder of this painting, the builder of this house. It's like, well, no, you that is what you was at that point. You're no longer the builder of that house. That house is being built, so you can't possibly be the builder for that house. It's this idea of the movement, of the change. I don't really know how I sit on those sorts of things. I think it's useful to conceptualize it in that way, but how actually true it is to identity, I'm unsure.
I don't think identity is enough to say that there's an experiencer. I mean, here's the case, right? I mean, computers. I mean, you can program a computer to have like an identity, that not like that it's experiencing some sort of self-consciousness. In that, I mean, how would we even know that was happening to whatever small degree? All we can know is that yeah, the computers might recognize what's a part of their entire system. Like, oh, this is you've selected to change out the hard drive. Oh, you decided to switch out the graphics processing unit. Oh, I see you changed this. You switched out the RAM for a larger cartridge. All of these things, like you can do that. You can also you can program these things into a computer, but we wouldn't say that's enough for an experience. The only presence of an experience that we're aware of, right, it seems, is our own. And even we might not be completely aware of all the things that are happening when it comes to our brain. There's the possible idea that we're only simply one consciousness that sits in this thing we call the brain. So even when it comes to things like that, where we have like problems with actually dealing with that fact, so, or a possible fact. So I think that instead of focusing on identity, right, like that there's the self, we should focus rather on the experience, because that's more what I think we're talking about when we say a self. It is being, rather than just identity.
I agree. That was my
disagree.
criticism. Yeah, I know you do. That was my argument against Leahy, where he said that identity is the self, and I was, no, identity is not the self. It is the conceptualization of the self.
what is the difference in the two way you're saying it? It's not the
One is the
self-existent concept.
awareness. One is the awareness, the faculty of experience, the mind, the understanding, and the other is what is to be understood. It's the combination of reason, of reason with the reality. You know, what is to be perceived. So when we apply, for example, what is the table isn't our understanding of the table, it is the table itself. You know, it is that reality. It's like, for example, this would be my criticism of when, you know, goddamn, ask yourself, he says, you know, a cow has the trait morally valuable to Isaac. And it's like, no, that is a relation. That is not the cow itself. The cow does not have that within itself. The cowness is what gives you that moral value, but it does not have within that cowness written morally valued by Isaac. And this is to understand that we are the relation, we are the experience itself, where we bridge the gap between what is and how it is to be understood.
Now, I would take
Okay.
two pieces of that in that I don't think even if there was a concept of self and that was what's giving a rise to an experience, we would still need experiences for relation in order for that to do anything or for that to mean anything. Things need to be
Yeah.
related to this concept in order for you to really have an understanding of what it is.
You need something to understand for it to have any purpose. And that's what I said. Like, you know, the will is the
And I don't
magnitude.
disagree with that.
But the will is the magnitude, but the direction comes with what is to be perceived. You know, you need something to discharge onto. But that's just the nature of what being. We could not exist without something to exist within. You know, if there was nothing to be perceived, then there's no point in perceiving.
Yeah, but I also think there can be things to perceive, and that there's no unified sense of self, and therefore the way that you're saying you're perceiving thing is just completely foreign and different. And I think it would be more like a computer. Whereas like Dio saying you can tell a computer that, you know, you right click on my computer and it says your computer name, but it doesn't understand that name as itself. And that's because that relation, that those words that are popping up don't relate in its conception of things to anything else about it. It's merely just a memory address in a specific place in the hard drive. We think of it as that computer because we're able to conceptualize the entirety of it, but it is not.
It's kind of like I love analogies.
No, we're actually running out of time. It's only like
Yeah, we got 1
a single
minute.
minute, so I think we should. Yeah.
We're gonna have to wrap
all
this
I was
one up,
gonna-
unfortunately.
Oh, okay. Sad times.
All right. This is one we should probably bring up on the show again at some point because I'm sure we could talk for a whole hour on it. But yeah, I guess we're just going to have to end the show, and I thank everybody for coming and discussing all these things that we've brought up today. And we'll be taking questions afterwards. Is there any of us who are planning on leaving and not sticking around for the half an hour?
Yeah, I'll have to go.
You gotta go, Dio? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Everybody else is good to stick around. We'll start answering some questions.
Yeah, I need the bathroom first, but yeah.
No, same. Drink coffee.
Okay. Well, hurry up. Okay.
I'll be
You
right
guys are
back.
just leaving me by myself here.
Why don't you marvel? Why don't you marvel at the beauty of the analogy I've just written down? Huh?
Oh, okay, where?
Yeah.
Where is it? Where'd you put it? It's like having a reflection of your reflection. Neither image knows one another. That is too poetic. I hate this man. I really hate this man. Okay. So I guess I'm waiting for them. Sorry, guys. I'll do a little song. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Waiting for the two people to come back, so I'm not alone and feeling awkward. It's weird, entertaining like 20 people. How is everyone doing? God damn. let me see. What questions? I'm making it up. Yeah, well, that's just
And
my
I'm-
nature. Welcome back. Okay, I'm gonna start taking questions. Okay, so the bottom one is the first one. Tand asks us, what are your opinion on Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch?
It's worthless.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Me and Lewis had this discussion, and we decided that like the only thing that was capable of doing it could never be human.
Yeah.
The idea of the Übermensch, Nietzsche seemed to have ideas about it which he didn't have chance to actually solidify. Where there's something beyond the Übermensch. It's more like the pure baby or some other sacred baby.
Well,
Yeah,
like
and then
Love
I
Spoke
completely
Zarathustra.
disagreed with that. Like,
Yeah, me and it's like one of the few things we agree on.
I think Jung does a good little criticism of Nietzsche there, where so one of the things that Nietzsche does is he divides ideas into two categories: Apollo and Dionysus, or Apollyon and Dionysian. Dionysus represents ecstasy, being in the moment, dance, that kind of more gut response, more losing yourself to it, that more chaotic side. Whereas Apollo represents order and structure, the bringer of light, those more that side of things, if that makes sense. And Nietzsche seemed to at first suggest that the point of the Übermensch was to be the fine balance between the two, like a tornado. Is always a good analogy. A tornado is chaotic, it's reckless, but at the same time it's got a form. You can see where it is, and you can point to where it isn't. It is controlled chaos in a way, and right in the center of that hurricane, of that tornado, is peace and quiet, right in the eye of it. That seemed to at first have been Nietzsche's idea. This idea of being a painter that can paint whatever he wishes of his own life, but having the strength to abandon his image and see himself in something else, rather than seeing himself in what he's painted. And then that's a will to truth.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the kind of point that the will itself has to be a combination between, like, you know, what I said before, with the magnitude and direction. With you can have as much strength as you want, but unless you can discharge it onto a world, it is useless. You need that, and that requires an order. You know, Dionysus is the uncaused will, the power of itself. You know, that has no authority over it. It's free in itself, while the actual direction requires a self in which to direct it. So there has to be that point in which you are on the, like, in what Blanchot would said. It would be that point in which you the cutting edge of decision, the moment of supreme possibility where his own impossibility will come to him in the form of power. That is the Übermensch. But then he goes on to say, well, actually, you'd probably just be dead, but not dead. That's Nietzsche's baby.
You just be undoing. You can't go from nothing to something.
I don't know. I still got more of I still have a kind of reading, but I do appreciate a lot of these points. Like the criticism Jung gave is that Nietzsche ended up going insane because he had ego death. That he destroyed the Apollo within him, and all he was left with was the chaos of the Dionysus.
That or syphilis.
Well, some studies are now showing that if he had got it, the likely chance of him getting it would have made the results come earlier in his life than what they did.
Okay. Unexpected Jihad asks, do we really exist? Do we really become one with the Force when we die? Well, I exist, I'll tell you that much. The rest
But
of
you would say that, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
That's a tautology. I'm just going to throw that out there. You're committing a logical fallacy, Shadow.
Shut down.
You show me one word that's not a tautology.
Mate, fucking burden of proof, pal, is on you.
Okay. Don't empiricism and rationalism contrast one another? Asks Serial. No?
Sometimes.
They don't have to.
They can, but they don't have to.
Yeah.
They tend to contrast more when it comes down to matters of the origin of information of knowledge. For if the empiricist argues that all knowledge is based on experience, literally all of it, then we have to say that before you were born, you had no experience. So the
Right.
traditional argument was that as a fetus there was no knowledge, and we'd have to say, well, it was only gained through the experience in the world or in the womb did you start picking up knowledge. But then if the argument is true that experience can never give you true and reliable information, and we're to also accept that our knowledge of logic and mathematics is true and reliable, then we must say, well, sometimes experience can lead to true and reliable information because we've got it over here. Or we would have to say, or we'd have to say that it's inherent. We were born with it.
Let's go coherency.
And that's what the rationalists are.
Let's just go coherency. Let's just skip to
Well,
that
the
bullshit.
coherency is that point in which I think is, with regardless, I would say that
Okay.
empiricism and rationalism should coexist, right? I think if you reject one for the other, then you're doing philosophy wrong. I
agree. I think it's a position called realism or something like that.
You know what? No, I think rationalism and empiricism are opposed. I think that's a true opposition. When it comes to the ideas of where, I mean, they're wholly pretty much positions taken on where ideas come from. I mean, rationalism is the position, that, I mean, we're not tabula rasa, right? I mean, and not only that we're not tabula rasa, but possibly that our ideas come from some reminiscence of some Platonic realm or something else, like they're baked into us. I mean,
you're going transcendental, and you don't need to.
I think that yes. Well, I think that Kant's view, right? Like in his attempt, what he's also attempting to do is to bring rationalist views and empirical views together. But what I think he does, actually, is really endorse more of a rationalist perspective on knowledge. So
I would say that Kant was a rationalist more than anything, but I think Kant's rationalism is to understand that there is some knowledge which is a priori synthetic. Knowledge is a.
You can open a can of worms if you say that to Dia. You can open up a can of worms.
The point is that there's some knowledge that knowledge is the combination of perception and what is to be perceived. And I think that, regardless of what experience is, awareness of experience and conceptualization of it are in relation to both, what is being perceived and then the actual ability to conceptualize it, to understand it, to make it intelligible. But I don't think it has to be permanently in relation to that for you to gain knowledge. So this would be a point to say, like, for example, abstractionists within language, like Russell, would argue that language is in relation to reality, and we gain, abstracted concepts from like reality itself. So blue, we encounter what is blue, while Peter Geach, he would argue that we construct a concept and then test it upon the world. That's where I would stand. But for a concept to have any worth, to have any value, it requires that world to be tested against.
It requires a public domain. But then again, the public domain could be achieved if it happened to be universal innate ideas. So what could be the case is that we could have innate ideas that are just wrong. There's no reason to suspect that just because an idea is innate to us from birth, that it must be true. There could just be faulty innate ideas that have came about due to genetics or evolution. But then there's also problems about what constitutes knowledge. There's a lot of hair splitting at the time between Cartesians and Lockeans when the debate first came about.
Well, I mean, it's innate knowledge, and in that sense, it would have to be then true, right?
Yeah, that's I hated this with obviously some discussions I may have had in the past, where what is knowledge, I would argue is related to the philosophy of right. What is true? What is actually correct? Not is what you think to be true, and that there is a division there, that a distinction. And if we're not allowing it, if we're not going to say there's a distinction, then that's something that we need to outline in any given conversation.
Well, that the distinction comes about when it comes into tabula rasa, because we say, well, are you a blank slate if you've got no knowledge, or are you a blank slate if you have no ideas? You see, you could still have ideas, but not knowledge. If it so happens that all humans are born universally with certain bits of information that do not apply to the definition of knowledge, and yet there is ideas. Are we born tabula rasa or not? That's where the definition comes more pedantic.
Yeah, I would say that like ideas is a good way to put it. Like we have what would be, you know, intrinsic ideas. I think that's true. But to gain knowledge, we need relation, and this is you know where I wouldn't say I'm an empiricist, because I would say that to even be able to have that test in the first place, you have to have the idea to test, and you know, to have something to test against, you have to have the world. And I think that's why I would say that they're compatible. I think rationalism and empiricism are somewhat compatible on this.
I'm very conflicted on this. I'm very conflicted. This is one of the things I need to look more into. But should we move on to the next question?
Yeah, sure.
All right. We have question for Perspective Philosophy. Is he ever going to respond to my points regarding the philosophy of anarchism?
Oh God, yeah. I'm sorry, man. I did say that I would respond to you. I said it at the start of this. They're gonna realized I will get back to you on this. I've just been so busy. I think.
Just say yes.
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Just for anyone that's wondering, might be worth bringing up. He's arguing that any organized any organization, I think, within anarchy, any what would it be, legislation, for example, would be an act of violence, and therefore could not be implemented in anarchy. So if we were to say that we you know, if there was, I think he said, like, there was 5 fishermen around a pond, and 3 of them agreed that they need to, you know, limit the times in which people can fish, that to implement this would be an act of violence upon the 2 other fishermen. And I think I responded with that to agree to any democratic situation in the first place, to actually enter into a social relation with another person where we can have, you know, a decision that will act on our behalf is to consent. I can't remember what your point against that was again. I'll have to. All right. All
right. Are we gonna go into it, or are we not?
You know what? Let's move on. But I'll get it back up for the rest of it.
All right. Question for Dave at the end. Can you describe Kant's response to the axe murderer objection to his categorical imperative?
Sure. There's 2 kinds of ways to approach this. One is more complicated than the other. The first one, and the famous one, is for Kant to just say, well, if the axe murderer, on hearing your response, goes and kills the man anyway. Actually, I should probably give you the axe murderer analogy anyway, just in case those who don't know it. The argument is that Kant says that there are certain rules that should not be broken, and if they are broken, then you're just wrong, and if you're more reasonable, you would know it. And these are moral rules, and so they become categorical imperative. And what Kant argues is that if morality is to exist, it's going to exist like rules do, and the rules are going to be applied to everyone at all times to the same degree, unless the individuals themselves, for other reasonable reasons, can be held less or more accountable. Perhaps the insane or the mentally ill, we would say, are obviously less morally capable than others, perhaps, or the intoxicated, you know, those sorts of general points. And one of the famous things Kant says is that you should never lie. And the response is that, well, let's say that your friend comes to you to seek refuge in your house and says, someone's after me, they come to murder me with an axe. And then you say, okay, go in my living room. You get a knock on the door, you answer it, the axe murderer is there, and he says, where is your friend? Now, if you lie, you've been immoral. But if you tell him the truth, he's going to go into that room and then kill your friend. And the argument is that, well, Kant doesn't allow you to lie, so you're going to result in your friend dying. one of the more important points Kant makes to this is that if you were to lie and say he's in the back garden, and your friend happened to overhear this conversation and decided to, leg it through the back door, and he encountered the axe murderer, then the only reason the axe murderer is there is because you told a lie, and now it's your fault. The odd view that Kant held, arguably odd, was that at the end of the day, the axe murderer is the one doing the immoral thing. You told the truth, and that's the moral thing to do. And the argument is that's obviously silly and just completely out of touch with reality. But there's two responses. The two responses Kant gives is, well, first, you don't have to answer the door. You could just refuse to actually give an answer. And the second point is that Kant argued that it's not that you must always tell the truth, it's that you should never lie. So yes, you could answer the door, and he says, where is your friend? I want to kill him. There's no reason why you can't say, you shouldn't do that. It's not good. That wouldn't be a good thing to do. Or you could say, well, come on, let's calm down now. Let's try and talk things through. You don't have to tell the truth. You just don't have to lie. Oh, why should you never lie? It's that Kant's rule of universalizability. It's that the rule must be applicable to all people at all times. And he defines a lie as to consciously and purposefully deceive a person, which requires you to know what the truth is in order to trick a person about it. But if everyone was lying all the time, firstly, you wouldn't be able to gain the truth because all your methods of measurement are themselves false. So whenever you use a tape measure, that's not what's been drawn as the centimeters is not actually true. You would never be able to get true information. But because everyone's lying to each other all the time, no one would know what the truth actually is, and no one would suspect that they could gain the truth from you, so you wouldn't actually be able to deceive them. So the idea is that the rule would undermine itself, and so it would fail universalizability.
You see, I would argue that Kant isn't appreciating language games because obviously he was maybe a bit early for this, and knowledge of knowledge. So like the point is that practice, given any practice, McIntyre would argue that everyone needs honesty. Was it honesty, courage, and I think it was honesty, courage, and I can't remember, but it's not important, the third one right now. The point is that everyone needs like a level of truthfulness, for example, for any given practice to work. But a good example of, how for any game to take place, we need to be honest about what the rules are. But you could have a rule in which you can lie. Poker is a great example of that. It is a common practice in poker that you can lie, but there is a difference between a lie which is applicable to the game and a lie which isn't. So lying about the hand you have is different to lying about whether the deck is rigged or whether you've got cards hidden up your sleeve. So truthfulness is defined within a social relation just as much as like the virtue of truthfulness and what it actually is defined in the social relation just as much as just as much as what it actually is. Like, it's not actually just about telling the truth. It's about how the functions of our practices, of our language, of our understanding of sentences and structures actually works, and what truth is in each scenario. To tell the truth in all cases would not necessarily allow practices to be properly worked. Like, if people always told the truth in poker, it would no longer be poker, for example. So there is a point in which there is an immorality, and there's a point in which it's not, and it's that knowledge which I don't think Kant is appreciating.
I would say Kant would respond to say, well, there's no moral lie occurring in a game of poker, because when you play the game of poker, you don't suspect that people are going to be telling you the truth, so you're not going to be deceived. You'd be a fool to play poker expecting everyone to be telling you the truth. So you're not going there looking.
I think that same criticism should be levied on him with society and all. So
exactly, you'd be a fool to think that his friend would tell you where he was.
Yeah.
Yes, but his response would be, that's a description of how society is now and what society ought to become. That's a different type of discussion than in reference to the game of poker, because we were only describing poker as it is.
Yeah, but that's the problem. We're playing an imperfect game, right? You can't say, things would be better this way if you're not also saying that everything else also has to be better at the same time. And sure,
Well-
maybe if everything's better all at the same time, then lying takes no precedence or usefulness. But given that that's
dep-
not the case, you're just ignoring what the game is.
Well, it depends. It depends what we mean, because I mean it would be bizarre to think that Kant thinks the only thing at play to make the world the best it can be is just that one rule. And,
Right.
and of course,
No, I know that. Yeah. But
So
so it has to all
would-
come at once or not at all.
Well,
Um,
Kant allows people to break certain rules to come to a different end. So Kant allows people to make threats of violence against each others if it would guarantee a stalemate, so that it de-escalates the situation. He will allow that. So he will allow you to potentially lie only in as much as it logic would necessitate it would result in a better end. But that's a very difficult thing to do,
Well,
and
then we're at
Kantians are
Hegel.
split on that.
We're at Hegel now, and we're in context and the a priori. Wait, I'm gonna get the quote. What is it?
do you guys want to continue on that, or do you guys want to move on to the next one? We were really,
I think
we were really
I mean,
only
Lewis's-
asked whether or not what Kant's response was. So
yeah. In a nutshell, his response is just remain silent. You don't have to answer the door.
okay.
You don't have to tell the truth.
Is anyone familiar with street epistemology approach to understanding an individual claim? Yes, I am on the street epistemology Discord, and I've watched some of their videos. It's essentially the Socratic method, and I really do like the works that they do. They tend not to ask or go to discuss any particular position. They just ask people, what is something you hold to be important? And then they ask, why do you hold that important? Like, how did you come to think that is the case? And I do like that approach, because a lot of the times when we have these kind of contentious conversations, it's because I hold this position and you hold that position. But this comes more from the angle of, like, it's not even that I disagree. It's just like you get to pick the topic and then you get to argue against your own topic. Like, I have nothing to do with this. And it's just a pure exercise of to see if people can come to their own realizations.
I am on street epistemology, but I've never really spoken on that.
I have no idea what you're
So
talking about.
I don't really think I could be much use in that.
Well, hopefully that answered the question. But yeah, if you go to YouTube and you search some street epistemology, you'll probably see some cool videos, and it's also a good guideline of how to go about the Socratic method. Let's go to the next question. Tennant asks two of them, so I'll ask his first one. Given a society where popularity is a measure of success, should the more popular individuals be treated differently when they break the rules? Can a cost-benefit analysis justify giving such a person a greater lenience?
No,
No.
because it'll open the doors up to a slippery slope. Because so on one hand, we would want to say that the more successful you are, the more held to account you will be. But it's more likely that the more successful you are, the more powerful you are to be able to say, well, actually, the rules don't apply to me as much as they apply to other people beneath me. When we would want it to be the other way around. So I could see it more likely going in a disfavorable way. So it's best to say we're all equal under the eyes of the law than to start making allowances and run the risk of allowing the wealthy to get away with crime, which arguably is what's already happening.
See, I would even go like a Hegelian way with this, and saying by allowing people to get away with crimes, by allowing them a leniency in any case, we are not giving them the advantage of the law. It is the freedom in which they can be freed from themselves to understand the purification of impartiality, and that, you know, the subjectivity of the individual will only rule them. They will be controlled by their urges, by their desires, and not be able to actually differentiate between the desires themselves, and be able to want, to mediate between what is the good desire and the bad desire. And in which case, we're not doing them any favors, we're only limiting their freedom. We're giving them more subjective freedom, but we're not giving them any objective freedom.
Boy, do I just disagree with a whole lot of everything you just said. I might be okay with a different cost benefit analysis, depending on the values of the people involved and what we consider to be important. But I think in general, we value that type of equality. That's the type of equality we do want to see. Like
Yeah, I mean,
when it tends to be the case, well, at least for me and most people I speak to, that when someone gets off of a crime because you find out they have a lot of money or a lot of fame, we tend to be very upset about it. You know, we have a sense of equal justice among people, and we want it enforced. So I don't know what kind of cost benefit analysis, in virtue of our values, could be said to be made there.
Yeah, well, I guess I just go back to my initial point there and say that we would want to hold them more accountable, but the chances are is that it will pan out that they would get away with more things. I mean, think about how long it's took for society to be able to get the wealthy and the rich accountable to the law. That we would say, well, actually, the kings and queens must abide by the law. The amount of wars and conflict that has been held over this, for us to just perhaps change that around, I don't think it's worth that sort of gamble, in my opinion.
Wait, Tenet wanted to add on. I wonder if you would answer differently if the assumption popularity is a goal becomes the primary axiom, meaning the society is different from ours in a way where popularity is the overarching goal.
That makes me feel sick.
But I still think that would be a personal goal, wouldn't it? Is this a society where we value those who are popular, or do we value ourselves becoming popular?
It sounds a little bit like Black Mirror. Like I've only seen the first episode of Black Mirror, and on that there's almost like a popularity rating that allows you to have like success, almost like you're able to apply for certain houses and so on like that. If you're essentially getting better ratings, it's like kind of like a sick Amazon like out of 5-star rating system. And I suppose it could work in some way, like it could function as a society. But I think the whole point of that episode is that it's a shithole. I shouldn't use those terminologies. It's undesirable because individuals within that society, although they may think that this is what they want, when in reality the ego is ruling them. They're flowing into what they think they should want, which is the nice car, the nice house, this consumability, this whatever it is. But in reality, maybe they want free from that. Maybe they want free from the burden that is that subjective will.
You seem to just take hedonism and egoism to just be the exact same thing.
No. I'm not saying that they are. I'm saying that they can be.
They're just both wrong.
I couldn't have said it better. No, but they can be wrong, and that's the point. There's a point in which subjectivity is good, and there's a point in which it's excessive, and that's an Aristotelian view. Sometimes to be, to act in a way in which you think is virtuous to an excess actually becomes a vice. So.
The problem with things becoming popular is that it reminds those that don't have it that they don't have it all of the time, and that can quickly turn from resentment into anger. So it'll be difficult. I think it's always dangerous to cultivate those sort of things.
Which leads to fear, which leads to suffering, which leads to hatred.
Man, fucking Yoda over here.
All right, well, we hit the end of the half an hour, so I think that's going to be marking the end of the show. I wanted to thank my co-talkers here for coming and giving their opinions on all the various issues, and I also want to thank the audience for showing up and listening and asking us questions and listening to what we have to say. And beyond that, I think we're done.
Yeah.
GG.
Although I know there's a couple of questions that still haven't been answered. So what I'll do is I'll just jump down to common room chat, and I'll be there to like talk about.
You just love philosophy that much.
Yeah, I'm gonna avoid doing my research by coming here to talk about my research.
All right, everybody.
Thank you everyone for joining, and it was really nice talking to everyone as well.
Yep. Check out Lewis's YouTube channel, Perspective Philosophy, and we might start uploading these podcasts.